Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event, to the 65th session of the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Our event is called Challenge Stigma Around Addiction Recovery Strength-Based Approaches. My name is Monika Parzini, and I'm Regional Project Manager at NGO Celebrate Recovery, who is organizing this event. And with our partners from Aspire Drug and Alcohol Services, Drug Free America Foundation, Recovery Connections, the SanPatrignano Foundation, University of Derby, and World Federation Against Drugs. So the recovery movement has grown over the past decade and created a hope-based and strength-based model for improving outcomes for people with addiction and those who seek recovery. And this model recognizes the significance and role of the community actors and building on community partnership approach. So well-being is strongly linked with social capital and also sense of connectedness and supporting pro-social networks and the community. And this event is about exploring and providing examples and evidence of mechanisms that create connections and social capital for this population to support their recovery journeys. It will also show the pathways into housing, employment, reintegration, and community, and the management of self-stigma will be also addressed. And this event will present best practices and innovation and challenges the stigma and also bring together the science and lived experience to help those in need. And our wonderful speakers will provide a meaningful insight into innovative models and research and examine how community organizations can change the perception and attitudes among people and practitioners. So I'm not gonna continue anymore. I'm gonna hand over to my colleague, Chantal Pepper, and she will chair this event, and I will let her introduce herself, as I'm really from another event and didn't prepare her bio. So I'm sorry.
Not a problem. Thank you, Monika. Thank you, everybody, speakers in particular. I'd like to welcome you to the Challenging Stigma Around Addiction and Recovery, Strength-Based Approaches webinar side event for the 65th Commission of C&D. So I've got the pleasure to introduce all the speakers. I will now introduce, I'm the chair for the Provincial Substance Abuse Forum in the Western Cape Government. I'm based in the ministry of our Provincial Minister of Social Development, and my role really is to implement and report on the National Drug Master Plan that's here in South Africa, but it's very provincial and local driven, and that's really my key role within government. So I have the pleasure to really introduce to a whole host of a range of speakers this afternoon. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the first speaker, who will be speaking on behalf of Christina C., and it is Miss Tina Miller. Christina is a student of the First Recovery High School in Tampa Bay, Florida, USA, at the Victory High School, a survivor of the foster care system, childhood trauma, and an active young person in recovery addictions. Christina is a talented artist and writer. She loves animals, especially equine therapy through school. She's excited to participate in this international conference to share her experience, strength, and hope that we do recover and there is healing available at any stage. So Miss Tina Miller, I will hand over the floor to you, and your time starts now. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to share on behalf of Christina. She had technical difficulties this morning, so I'm so sorry that she's not able to be here, but she did actually beautifully write something to share with all of you. Christina is 17 years old, and she writes, "It's been a long 17 years in my short life. I am a survivor of childhood trauma, abuse, domestic violence, neglect, and drug addictions. I was abandoned by my birth parents and placed in foster care at 5 years old. I was attending elementary school in kindergarten when a social worker came and picked me up and told me I was going to spend the night somewhere. I actually have spent the night elsewhere than my own home ever since. I was placed into foster homes, and then I was adopted. I have spent many, many nights in shelters, residential facilities, and mental health hospitals. It's been a hard, long 17 years. I never got to be a kid. I worried about everyone and everything all of my life. I struggle with depression, anxiety, and PTSD. This led me to abusing alcohol and drugs. When I would attend high school, I would either sleep or I would attend when I was under the influence of drugs. When Victory High School was first introduced to me, I didn't want to go. I thought it was just another high school, and I thought, oh great, I'll just go and I'll sleep or I'll get high again. But Victory High School was different. I started Victory High School, the first recovery high school in Tampa Bay, in April 2021. There was only 2 of us students, but I felt like I belonged from the first day. It was the first place I felt safe. When I ran away from home due to neglect and abuse, I still went to school. Every day I attended Victory High School. I don't sleep much at night, maybe 2 hours. At Victory High School, I can actually sleep. Miss Tina allows this because she understands my childhood trauma and that sleep is very important. Also that nutrition is important and being hydrated. Oftentimes teenagers aren't eating healthy foods and they're definitely not drinking enough water. Miss Tina is always making sure that I eat and that I drink enough water and that I can get my sleep, as well as an education. For once in my life, I'll be graduating in May, turning 18 years old in June. Victory High School has given me a supportive, safe environment. I have a family that I've never had before. Today I have hope. I want to actually just share with you, as the executive director and founder of Victory High School, the first recovery high school in Tampa Bay, that research has shown that 94% of students that attend recovery high schools throughout the United States, 94% have actually survived childhood trauma. With recovery high schools, it's an initiative that it's so important for us to address that childhood trauma with all of our students. If we can stabilize them emotionally and mentally, then they have an opportunity to learn, but only if they're stabilized first, emotionally and mentally. Also, I would like to share with you that Victory High School, I designed it so that our students feel like they belong, that they are not their label and they are not their diagnosis, that they are actually caring and lovable, and also that they are victorious. Oftentimes people think that young teenagers that are abusing drugs are attention seeking, but I'm here to tell you, as a woman in recovery myself of 24 years, it's connection seeking. All of us that are in recovery need to connect. And that's why I'm so grateful for this webinar, in this conference, and each one of you for being here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Miller. Thank you for sharing the story, Christina, as well. It really was touching, and it's such an encouraging message for all of us, that are on this platform and our listeners. It really is. Adolescence is key in terms of recovery in future and adult life as well. So I just want to say thank you, Ms. Miller and Christina, for that wonderful testimony about recovery. All right, colleagues, Thank you for that. I will move straight to Mr. David Best, who's our following speaker. He's a professor of criminology at the University of Derby in the UK and an honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. He is the author and more than 200 peer-reviewed research papers and 7 books on addiction recovery and dissidence from offending. His specialist area of work is around defining and measuring recovery capital. Mr. Best, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chantel, for that introduction. And all of those things about credits and achievements are just evidence of the fact that I am, in fact, very old. So on the subject of that, for people who might notice, actually, that my Australian university has remained the same, but on the title slide, you will see that my nomadic career continues because I'm just about to change British university yet again. But that's another story. So just a very brief background because I know time is tight. So I've worked in the addictions field for just about 30 years now. And around half of that time, I've worked in the area of recovery research. And in that time, I have collected about 2,500 recovery stories in the UK, in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And there are some things I think that are common facets. Now, I'm afraid it's my job to be the kind of boring academic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theory. And my main area of work is around recovery capital. And I did a lot of research around social models of recovery. And I still think that recovery is a fundamentally and intrinsically social process. As Tina's just put in the chat, people do recover. The best estimates we have is that between 50 and 58% of all those who have a lifetime substance use disorder will eventually recover. But the thing that gives us as scientists hope is the notion of recovery capital, a framework and a monitoring system for counting what resources people have and what resources they may need to continue their recovery journey. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Cressida. And both Cressida and her colleagues all know I'm far too incompetent to speak and do slides at the same time. When the concept of recovery capital was developed, people really only talked about it in strength terms. So the original iteration of recovery capital was really about what resources, and then the definition was the breadth and depth of resources people have available to them to support their recovery journeys and pathways. And in my work with Alexandra Lodi in 2010, we categorized this, or recategorized, I should say, into 3 component parts: personal capital, social capital, and community capital. And they are interacting and dynamic. And the key point, I guess, for lots of the work in the top row here is basically kind of suggesting that the ultimate aim is to build up those personal recovery capital elements: self-efficacy, self-esteem, communication skills, resilience, and coping skills. But that to achieve that, over what we typically think of as a 5-year recovery journey, requires the input of the other 2 things. In other words, people cannot do it on their own. They need positive social networks and they need access to resources from communities. And we've always thought of capital in a kind of strengths positive based iteration. In 2009, the original authors of some of the recovery capital work, Cloud and Granfield, produced a paper where they started talking about negative recovery capital, bad things that are barriers to recovery. And in our own work, this is something that we increasingly identify and recognize, that addressing barriers and unmet needs is, to borrow a phrase from a colleague, putting out fires. And before you can start to build a new building, you need to put out the fires. And so essentially, there are 2 social barriers that we primarily talk about: embedding and using and offending networks and social isolation. There's a structural community level barrier that's going to be particularly important to stigma, which is marginalization and exclusion. And the absence of, or the inverse of, some of those personal strengths that people need. Now, when I was thinking about this talk, what I wanted to do was to think about both a theoretical and an empirical way of measuring and conceptualizing stigma as a recovery capital concept. And I was talking to one of my colleagues earlier, Aaron Sondy, about how we might measure some of these things. And it seems to me that there are three categories of stigma, that each of which can be classified as a form of negative recovery capital. So at the individual level, self-stigmatization is in effect the internalization of adverse labels and the assumption of the identities that are conferred on individual, the negative identities. So effectively, after so many times have been told you're useless and worthless, you come to categorize yourself as useless and worthless. But that applies not only at the individual level, it also applies at the group level. And groups of individuals are excluded and marginalized. So friendship networks will be seen as, and around substance use and around offending, will be seen as negative, to be avoided, to be shunned, to be punished, to be excluded. And so you have this complex identity phenomenon of stigma, which links both to how people see themselves, but also links to the groups they belong to. That is compounded through structural factors, active exclusions, structural barriers to reintegration. And I'm just very briefly going to talk about some of the criminological theories about desistance and barriers to desistance, which speak directly to this. So, President, can I have the next slide, please? There are two models I really want to talk about. So Shad Maruna and Steve Farrell, and then Fergus McNeil, talked about stopping offending as having three steps. Primary desistance, when you just stop committing the crimes. Secondary desistance, when you your identity changes and how you're perceived by others change. And tertiary desistance, when you're allowed access to those resources and communities. And how likely you are is not down to you, but down to structural factors. And my academic mentor and hero, John Braithwaite, argued nearly 30 years ago that we can kind of divide groups and societies into two categories, those that are disintegrative, that once people are shunned and excluded, they're not allowed back in, and those that are reintegrated. And for recovery, we need to think about this as a mechanism of how do we encourage active hot pathways to reintegration through peers, through access to housing, and through removing those structural barriers like debarring services for offenders. Last slide, please. Now, I did see the 2 minutes, and I'm going to try and go as fast as I can. So, Stuart may well touch on this, but one of the things we've tried to do is to move recovery out of the specialist clinics into communities, to challenge stigma through the notion of visible, identifiable, inclusive and community networks, to create recovery cities that are better than well, to generate recovery-oriented systems. And I just want to finish on this point. Financial capital, it's, as we all sadly know, if you have some and you spend it, you have less afterwards. Social and recovery capital isn't like that. You use up social capital and there is more of it, because it is a positive, generative thing, a social contagion that's like a ripple effect. If we want to challenge stigma, we can do it through structural change, but we can do it much, much more strongly through social processes of success and active community building activities. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you so much. You actually ahead of time. You had 15 seconds to go.
I won't try and use them up. I'll stick now.
Thank you so much. And I mean, your two slides really, it just taught me something as well, because us in government, we always have to ask ourselves, how do you measure recovery? You know, and when is recovery? Is it when they finish treatment and go into the communities and then you tick off, that's one target? So this has really given us and my fellow colleagues that are in the chat room as well, food for thought. So I really thank you. I really think this, I definitely will look into this more so. But thank you again. And
thank you, Chantal.
Thanks, Father. Brilliant. Thanks, David. Okay, so the next speaker, we will be having Mr. Stuart Green. He's the service manager at Aspire, ambassador for visible recovery in the UK, strength-based recovery, presenting on stigma and the role of LEROs. Lived experience recovery organizations, that's the acronym. Stuart is also in 22 years in recovery, apologies to it, and works in the NHS delivering addiction and recovery services. So, Mr. Green, I hand over the floor to you, and thank you.
Thank you. I'll have the first slide. Thank you. So I think, thank you, David, and you're always a hard act to follow. What I would say is, you know, I'm actually at a tipping point where I've spent longer in recovery, 22 years, than I have in active using. In the UK now, what we're starting to see is where people commission services, they're building a social value return. Because when people are in recovery, they become assets to the community rather than drains or leaning on community for resources. So that's increasingly something we're starting to see in the UK. I've come today to talk a little bit about LEROs. There's a group of connectors which meet fortnightly called the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations, but LEROs are the diamonds. These are the best kept secrets in the UK, and we are actually starting to look at even international representation, I believe, from Canada as well. So one thing that's happened during the pandemic is that networks have been able to form really quickly for lived experience recovery organisations, which are LEROs, which I'm talking about today. I think one thing that's very clear about LEROs is that it's about visible recovery, it's about wellness. They are stigma busting, both in terms of social stigma and personal stigma as well. Next slide, please. So these are some of the characteristics of LEROs. I'm not going to read through them, but one thing that's really core in terms of LEROs is the Chime acronym, which comes from Professor Mike Slade's work in the mental health field in the UK, but has been adopted widely in the drug and alcohol field, which is around connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And running services in the UK, what's clear is you can treat people in hospitals and institutions, but they stay well in communities. And the more you can build up that community resilience, people will continue to stay well, and they don't end up back returning into services. So from a strength-based approach, LEROs are very much strength-based, whereas often services are commissioned through deficits, health needs assessments, or health inequalities. Next slide, please. So this is the Chime model. You can Google it. It is there. It's all connected. I think Chime also links very neatly to the 5 ways to well-being as well. So when you look at the 5 ways to well-being, these are the core principles that keep us all well as individuals and humans. And I think, like the example of when someone spoke at the beginning about their personal story, connection is really key. And if we don't connect to positive relationships, it's not surprising people connect to substances in that. It's about well-being, and in the 5 ways to well-being, there's connect, do more activity, learn, give, and pay attention, which I think run in a similar orbit to the Chime model, which is there. And next slide, please. So when we start to look at helping relationships, they're often imbalanced. I think the positive thing about addiction is that people are seeking something to try and make them feel better. It may be taking something away or pain, but they've got an energy of wanting to change something. And if you can harness that energy, often in a traditional helping relationship, there's a significant power imbalance. So what we've got is often the clinician or the medic has got 90%, the patient 10%. Society stigmatized, that feeds addiction. So often society feels shame and guilt, families feel shame and guilt. So trying to offer visible addiction as a long-term health condition is a way forward in the UK. And I think the NHS is a non-stigmatizing brand in the UK. So it offers a really good opportunity for people to be treated as from a long-term condition. Where LEROs fit in, I think it's an equal relationship. I think people feel they're valued, able to give and connect. They don't feel a power imbalance in that process. Next slide, please. So a bit about LERO-centered helping. I think the key one is really interesting because often people come to services through criminal justice orders or are coerced by family. And I think you've got to be really careful that when you look at services are often service-centered rather than people-centered and create weights, whereas LEROs are very much person-centered. But when people, as Roseworth Mccartney said, people who do not want to be helped can experience it as violence as it's done to them. LEROs, I think what's beautiful about LEROs is they will love you until you can learn to love yourself. So they're not time limited. They're very much go at people's paces. It's not output, it's outcome focused. So there's a whole benefit about how LEROs support people in a different way. They meet people on people's terms. And I think they're also stigma busting. What we've increasingly seen, and I'm presuming that's worldwide, is the pandemic and how grassroots LEROs have risen to the challenge when traditional services have had to close the doors due to COVID and actually form networks and structures to support individuals both in recovery and struggling with addiction issues. Next slide, please. The trick in the UK is how do we get lived experience or recovery support services working with traditional structures. Recovery support services and LEROs are very flat structures. So how they often work and engage with structures often is quite challenging. So it's building that bridge. It's recognizing that there's parts to play for both. And it's important that there is both within all local areas. Okay, next slide, please. Language is really key. We see in LEROs, people are people. I think when we start to stigmatize using language, if you see people as it's self-inflicted, you're actually part of the problem, not the solution. So it's very much about language when we look at LEROs. It's very much about connection. It's very balanced in terms of how we describe people and activities. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about LEROs challenging social stigma. LEROs offer visible success in their local areas. They also offer a view that people can be nice in recovery. It busts that professional fallacy that people don't recover. It offers insight into what works, both through natural recovery and service recovery, going through treatment services as well, and sees people as people and not as addicts. Next slide, please. LEROs also challenge personal stigma. So it's about connection, it's about belonging, it's about no power imbalance, it's about identification, it's about not beating yourself up, it's about realizing that no one sets out to become an addict or have a dependency problem. It's maybe about life's choices and how you do things. People get slipstreamed by people doing well and can share stories, which is better than sharing drugs. It's about equal and belonging. And the last slide, please. Thank you. And that's us. We have got an email for LEROs. If you want to know more about what we're doing in the UK around it, certainly link in with us. I'm happy to put my email in the chat. And thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Perfectly on time again. And I'd just like to commend all the speakers thus far for being very on time. Again, we learned something new with Stuart's presentation now as well. You know, we always tend to focus on demand for treatment and, you know, what happens after treatment, like Stuart said, what are the communities like? What are the families like? And here in South Africa specifically, we tend to see high relapse rates as soon as they leave to go back to the same communities, the same families. So we really need to look at how do we strengthen the family and the community in order for us to, you know, encourage a recovery or make recovery possible. So thank you, Stuart. Very insightful. And again, the presentations will be shared. And we do have one Q&A question for Stuart, but I think we will just let that stand over for the end. So Monika, just make a side note there. There's a question for Stuart. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce the next speaker. And that is Ms. Dot Smith. She is the CEO of Recovery Connections, a lived experience recovery organization. She has worked in mental health and addiction services for 38 years and is passionate about people having the right support to make self-defined change. She is a steering group member for the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organizations, a Winston Churchill Fellow, and the current Northeast Charity Leader of the Year. So over to you, Mrs. Dot Smith. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantel. And you know, just to say, I'm absolutely delighted and privileged to be here today. I'll just go into sharing my presentation, and hopefully the story that I'm going to tell about the development of recovery connections within Middlesbrough in the northeast of England fits in really well with David and Stuart's slides earlier. I'm going to talk really about how we've approached a town-wide you know, mission really in terms of improving the lives and wellness of the communities and more so people who use drugs and alcohol. Our vision and mission is really about reducing stigma and discrimination and help people to thrive and live their best lives. And that is a self-defined best life. We very much travel alongside people and offer people the tools and the knowledge and the connection and friendship and community to get to where they want to go to. We're very much founded on our values. Our values, mission and vision were all co-produced with the community that we're a part of and the community that we belong in and also support. It was quite a lengthy process. It's not the easiest way to come up with a vision, mission and values, but it's the right way when you're a lived experience recovery organisation. So what we do in Middlesbrough is we're a staff team that's made up of 91% of people in recovery themselves or recovery from their family members and loved ones. We have a locality-wide approach and we're very much centred around our values. We take everything back to our values as a way of guiding our next steps or resetting where we're at, coming back to our values if things are not going too well or we're not feeling quite right about something. And the things that we do in Middlesbrough include a residential rehab that also includes a day attendance rehab. We have a recovery community centre, we provide trauma therapy, we have employment support, and we also support students in recovery at Teesside Uni. We have a community business social enterprise and an employee assistance programme, all of which is led by the community that we support, and ultimately we want to help people live well, do well and feel well. A little bit about Middlesbrough, just to give you an idea of the culture of the town that we belong to and that we deliver within. A population of 139,000 people. It's ranked 5th most deprived area in England. It's a relatively new town from an English perspective in that it was founded on the steel industry in the early 1800s. There's no longer a steel industry in Middlesbrough, and the knock-on effect of that is a lot of unemployment, a lot of poor health, an in-treatment population of around 2,000 people. We know that there's many more that are not receiving help and support for addiction. We know that there's around about 6,000 people living within a household where they don't see their parents go out to work. So there's a lot of hopelessness within the town and a lack of aspiration for young people coming through into their early adulthood. And sadly, within some of the areas of Middlesbrough, life expectancy is 12 years lower than more than other areas of Middlesbrough. 12.6 years for men and 12 years for women. A lot of poor health, poor physical health, high prevalence of obesity within the town, a lot of poverty and deprivation and the inability to afford, good, nutritious food. So one of the things that we have within the town centre is a recovery community centre. This is taken at night. We're just really lucky that there's been a new art installation put in a derelict high-rise, which is just out the back of the recovery community centre, which is a beating heart. And I thought that was quite apt really for the work that we do within that community centre in the town centre. It's an open access building, which is really important. People can drop in as and when they need it. It's open 6 days a week. It has a communal space around in a very, it's a large kitchen area where the magic happens, where people come together opportunistically, sharing their hope and their stories and supporting people who might not be having a good day or who might not be where they really want to be in their journey. It's a culture of recovery, and that's led by peers and that's managed by peers. The culture is really important within that community centre, and it's held, in line with our values around having a positive environment for people who might be vulnerable in that moment. It also has some space where therapeutic groups take place. Therapy, one-to-one therapy in terms of the trauma therapy. We have an ICT suite where people can apply for jobs and do training, who can access support to build up those ICT skills that are really important in the world, and training, start their journey of education and training. I just wanted to bring in the free hot coffee bike because the theme of today's event is about stigma. This wasn't our idea. This was kindly shared by Professor John Fryer from Virginia Commonwealth University, and the free hot coffee bike is visible in the town centre, having opportunistic conversations with people, giving away a free cup of recovery roast, which is our own blend of single origin coffee that the recovery community designed with a local roastery. Does some phenomenal work. It helps people get into treatment. It helps families get support. It helps reduce stigma through conversations, because everybody that's out with the bike is in recovery themselves. So they put a face to recovery in an area that really desperately needs that. One of our recent additions is about providing employee support within a big employer in the town that does mandatory drug tests. So they also have a very social conscience, that they have a zero tolerance, but they don't want to sack people who test positive for drugs. So we're working with them to put in a support package to prevent that person losing their job and prevent the organisation losing a skilled employee, and also helping the community in terms of the economic reinvigoration. Once somebody loses their job, the household loses that income, and the knock-on effect that that can have on the family, on the economy, on the street, and importantly on the individual. Our social enterprise and training academy it's in the town centre. One of the brilliant benefits that has for people who are on their recovery journey going through the training academy is they work within the florist or within the event space or the cafe or out on the catering van. They're there as an employee or as a volunteer who, in terms of their identity, they're a waitress, they're a chef, they're a florist. They're getting that real positive self-esteem building and self-confidence and challenging that negative self-stigma of who they are, where they've been and where they want to go to, and to have conversations as a person first and foremost, and not as somebody that's carrying that shame, guilt and stigma of being previously in active addiction. And we also do work on the campus supporting students in recovery to navigate that educational experience and the stress that education can bring. And also The Student in Recovery Campus programme gives that great hope and aspiration for people in our recovery community to show that it's possible. It's possible to go on into academic learning and to become an academic. We've got examples of that where people have come through our rehab and then gone on to entry-level adult education and then over to the university. We're really looking at that town-wide recovery community asset from all angles and helping that recovery community thrive in a way that we know it can, and provide that leading example to others who need to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dodd-Smith. Thank you. A little bit over time, but I think that's okay, because you're actually giving our colleagues from across the world an idea and examples of how you actually, part of it is part of recovery. And I love the Recovery Community Center. I love that concept, because in actual fact, after treatment, what happens to the youth that go into recovery, in aftercare? And I would like to just commend on your efforts, because I feel that really is something that we as a society need to look at, because in essence, it's how do we reduce poverty and unemployment within our communities as well, and that speaks to that as well. You know, how do we get them become productive citizens, you know, after treatment? Because one of our organizations I'll never forget is we're getting funding for treatment, but we don't stop there. It will continue up until 6 months. Not the treatment part, but having them there, you know, keeping them busy, providing skills development. So, Dot, I really love your presentation. Thank you for sharing. And I think it's a model that we can all incorporate in our respective, you know, communities. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so the last speaker would be, sorry, second last speaker, sorry, Monika, is David Mccartney. He is an addiction doctor and a clinical lead at LEAP, an NHS-based residential rehab program in Edinburgh, Scotland. He also chairs a Scottish government group aimed at improving access to rehab. He is in long-term recovery as well. So, David, it's the floor's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. I've really enjoyed the presentations so far. They've been really, really good. And unfortunately for me, I don't have any slides, so I've got nothing to hide behind. It's just me. I'm going to talk a little bit about a proposition I was given recently, an intriguing proposition. I was asked to write a chapter for an academic book about stigma and addiction. It was a bit of a surprise because I'm not an academic, I'm a clinician. But I was asked to write about the part that peers with lived experience can play in challenging stigma. So all of that sounds good and well, but then here comes the tricky bit. I was asked to blend my own experience of stigma in addiction and recovery with what the academic literature says, and explore the role that peers can play in making things better. And that was definitely a challenge for me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the learning from that. Now, as somebody with lots of recovery capital, at least on paper, my experience of stigma is not necessarily what my patients go through. I'm really aware of that. I'm not trying to draw an equivalence, but there are some similarities, and certainly in terms of the kind of themes and impacts of stigma. And I hope also in terms of the solutions, certainly the solutions that I found. So I'm going to take off my professional hat and talk mostly as someone with lived experience, which I'm not used to doing, so this feels very exposing. So I'm in long-term recovery, has been said, from substance dependence, and my background is general practice. I was a general practitioner in an inner city practice in Glasgow, and my relationship with alcohol over a period of time, first of all, became problematic, then became harmful, and then became really dangerous. And there were consequences. I experienced my life unraveling, really, with impacts on my mental health, on my physical health, my relationships, the quality of those relationships, and on my ability to be a good doctor, and something which I invested a lot of my self-identity in. I ended up filled with shame, and that shame prevented me from asking for help. I was absolutely terrified of the consequences of coming forward. I thought that I was going to lose my job. I thought I'd lose my reputation. I thought I'd be the source of ridicule, or even worse, of pity. So like many recovery journeys, and many people who'll be listening to this will experience this, my journey was not a straight line, and it certainly didn't happen very quickly. It took place over a long period of time, and I'm not going to go into the detail of that. But eventually I did get to the place where I had to ask for help because I'd run out of other options. And I started outpatient treatment. And while I was really grateful for that treatment, it was high quality medical treatment, it certainly had its limitations as well. And those limitations were it almost entirely centered around medication. I stopped drinking, but my life only got a little bit better. I was still thinking and obsessed by alcohol when I was sober. So I had a relapse. I had much more severe consequences following the relapse. I actually did lose my job, and life suddenly seemed very dark. And I probably experienced the most despair I've ever had in my whole life at that point. This time, however, instead of going back to the clinic, I phoned a helpline. It was a helpline for doctors who were addicted to alcohol or other drugs. And this time I spoke to a peer, another doctor in recovery, someone who'd been where I was but wasn't there any longer. He suggested I go to rehab, which I didn't really know much about. And this time I found the kind of treatment that really suited me best. It was a very different experience second time round. So when I was in rehab, I met people from a variety of different backgrounds, but with a lot of similar experiences, certainly of the way addiction had made us feel. We were all struggling with shame. We were all struggling with loss of self-esteem. And we had a lot of unhelpful self-stigmatization. So in sharing those experiences and telling each other what been going on for us, we started to normalize some of those experiences. The realization that other people had had similar experiences actually helped to take some of the fear away. And I began to realize that my experiences were pretty normal when I compared them to other people who were struggling with addiction. My peers were helping me in a way that professionals and medication had not been able to. Now, as an addiction doctor, I don't say that lightly because I do believe in medical interventions too. But the thing that helped me most was my peers. So from rehab, I was connected to a peer group of doctors and dentists in recovery. And the local meeting of this support group was actually just a short distance away from the very clinic I'd already had treatment in for my alcohol dependence. But the resource had never been mentioned. And it turned out that that was one of the most important stepping stones in my recovery. When I attended that meeting, my professional shame began to melt away. And I'm not saying here that I just, felt a little bit better because I was talking to people with similar experiences. I'm talking about something at a much higher level of importance to me. I was profoundly changed by attending not just this mutual aid meeting for doctors, but for mutual aid meetings generally. I heard stories very similar to my own story, but the stories, most of the people I was hearing these stories from were much further on than I was. They had learned how to get out of the hole that I had found myself in. And they were acting for me both as role models and supporters. And probably the most important thing was introduced really early on, an essential element for recovery, something we need. You can't bottle it and you can't prescribe it, but that element is hope. And it was hope that took me on to the next step, and hope that helped me take action to make things get better. And that hope came from my peers. So getting back to work with a history of addiction can be really quite challenging. We've heard that already. And I decided at the point of trying to get back to work to seek counsel from a very senior medical figure who I respected greatly. It took me a lot of courage actually to speak to him. But the support that I'd had from my peers helped fuel that courage. Now, he listened to my story, and then he said something I really didn't expect him to say. He told me that with my history, I would never work in general practice again. He told me that I ought to go back to retrain as a junior doctor in hospital and choose another subject to another specialty to train in, because I certainly wouldn't get back to general practice. The message was really clear. We don't want your sort in general practice. So we know that stigma can prevent employment for those with substance use disorder history. There's plenty of evidence of that, but it also happens in other settings too. I experienced further stigmatizing problems. I was on benefits at the time, And in the benefit system, I experienced stigmatization. And also in the national press, who got hold of my story, and I was exposed, my entire addiction history was exposed in the national press in Scotland, which then threatened my employment. I was working for the Royal College of General Practitioners at the time, who, like my senior colleague, were worried that I would bring their reputation, the reputation of the organization, into disrepute. So every time I had one of those experiences, even though parts of my recovery felt quite strong, another part of me regressed. My self-belief faltered, and a very vulnerable part of me spoke up in my head and said, "You're worthless. You're not worth it." So as well as the discriminatory attitudes I was experiencing externally, I was also really hard on myself. I was self-stigmatizing. So if this is the sort of thing that a resourceful, privileged, professional, middle-class doctor had to contend with, imagine how hard it is to those with less opportunity and with less recovery capital, people like the very patients that are in this building that I'm sitting in at the moment. So what got me through these difficult experiences, as I said before, it wasn't medication, it wasn't attending clinics, it wasn't professional interventions. What got me through this was peer support. I continued to meet with colleagues at the British Doctors and Dentists group, the support group I mentioned, and attend other mutual aid groups. And each time I connected, I felt supported. I felt as if we were doing the journey together. Each time I shared what was going on for me, my shame eased a little bit, solutions began to open up. And research certainly shows that peers, contact with peers is one of the best ways to help tackle stigma. Yet in an audit of 250 people who were attending addiction clinic, addiction treatment in Edinburgh, this is about 10 years ago, 250 people were asked, how many of you have ever been to mutual aid groups? Only 1%, in fact, it was less than 1% of people in treatment had ever been put in contact with mutual aid. We need to do much better. Peers are not the only thing that matters, but professional attitudes do well. And because of positive professional attitudes, the non-stigmatizing and compassionate attitudes of GP colleagues, I was back working in general practice 3 weeks after I'd seen the senior medic who told me I'd never work as a GP again. So how do we tackle those negative beliefs and behaviors that exist within our own healthcare and social care systems? Well, I think lived experience, just as we've heard with Lero's and mutual aid, people in recovery, speaking up, telling our stories. It's not without risk. I'm feeling that risk just now as I'm talking to you. But when we do, we have the power to change minds and to win hearts. When I was caught up in the misery of addiction, I believed at some level I was a bad person and a bad doctor. Yes, I did experience some stigma in relation to my addiction and even in my recovery, but it turns out this was nothing compared to the terrible way I treated myself. I was my worst own critic. I was paralyzed by fear, self-doubt, and shame. When I was treated as a sick person, a sick doctor, by colleagues and peers, I was able to let go of my shame. I was able to heal. When I sat with people who did similar experiences to me, but who'd moved on to recovery, who didn't judge themselves and who didn't judge me, then I could give up some of that paralyzing self-stigma. I'm nearly done. I don't know if I've run out of time, but I've got
yes, unfortunately you have 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll just finish up by saying Patty D said that the shortest distance between two people is a story. And I think we need more stories in more forums to help us tackle stigma, both external and internal. Sorry if I've gone over.
No, thank you, Dr. Mccartney. Your words are spoken very true for most of us, not just within the field, but also out there. So I can only imagine how people are struggling when they, not privy to all the information and, being in the sector as well. So thank you for sharing your personal lived experience. It's not easy to share always, but thank you for sharing. And as you indicated, I think more professionals within this field also need to come up and step out and not keep quiet with their lived experience, because stigma it can really hamper a lot of our progress. So without further ado, we are behind schedule. I would like to introduce Monika Parzini. Currently, she's the head of the international relations at SanPatrignano. Began working at SanPatrignano as an educator in 1979, mentoring girls and women in their recovery from drug use disorders. In 1998, she joined the international relations team, coordinating, tutoring, study visits, and workshops to the community, offering training to students, voluntary groups, social workers, policymakers, scholars, and people working in the field of addiction, both Italian and foreign. So, Monika, I hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal, and thank you to all these inspiring speakers that really shared with us their stories, their experiences, very inspiring. And so there is not so much to add, but I would like to explore the consequences of stigma and self-stigma on a particular group, women, and even more in particular, women who have children. I think that stigma for women who have children is at the highest level, and the blame associated to being mother and using drugs is even the higher possible. For this reason, actually, the standard intervention with this kind of situation and with the aim of protecting children, the idea is that, but the out of placement of children from the family or the single mother with no further intervention to support the family of the mother to deal with their issues connected to drug use so that they can get their children back is something that it is not applied. And so this causes a lot of trauma to children and mother as well. Foster care and adoption are not good options. Actually, they are considered adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and they are often associated, linked. It is evident with research. They are associated with adolescent malaise. It is called adopted child syndrome that can lead to the development of difficulties and substance use disorder later in life. Thus, adverse childhood experiences that are most often, we all know, the root causes of development of substance use disorder become transgenerational. Therefore, it is evident that the best approach is to support the whole nucleus, family nucleus, or mother and child, so that they can all heal all together and improve the quality of life. The Convention of the Rights of the Child, as well as the most recent recommendation at the UN international level, strongly suggest this kind of approach. So it is my pleasure to present you not only the numerous residential centers that welcome mother and kids in treatment for a recovery process, but also an intensive care program which was elaborated by the Italian Ministry of Labor and Welfare in association with the University of Padua, which works exactly with this vision, with vulnerable families, including those with substance use disorder. The idea is to build on the strength and resiliency of children and family. And actually the name PP, the name of the program, which means Program of Intervention for Preventing Institutionalization of Children, is also inspired by the amazing Resilient Girls, which is protagonist of the famous Swedish novel, Pippi Longstocking. She is a resilient girl that can face any difficulties and build on her strength rather than looking at the weakness and difficulties. This is what this PP project is based on. It is a people-centered approach that gives the family an opportunity to regenerate and recreate a new dimension, so that to interrupt the transgenerational replication of those conditions that can only cause further sufferings to families and children, continuing the negative conditions such as social, economic, and educational deprivation that can only bring to further marginalization, to further development of substance use disorder. So I think that this stigma that brings to the out of placements of children from mother who use drugs should be removed and completely substitute with a different, totally different approach of understanding, helping, and support in a holistic way to support children and women altogether. Thank you.
Wow, Monika, thank you so much. You actually be ahead of schedule, which is great. But also, I just feel like we can discuss this, you know, this hour was just not enough, you know, because there's so much that we can touch on. But thank you so much for your insights, your experience, which is more than 42 years now within the field and developing that model, because women who use drugs with children, we all know that the barriers to treatment, for instance, is just the fact that they are, you know, they are scared, they are fearful that their children will be taken away, as you indicated now, Monika, you know, and that is one of the key things of almost like the barriers of women actually in recovery, to recover, because they don't actually initially then ask for that help because they are fearful that their children will be taken away from them by social services. And, you know, that is a real barrier that we all experience all over the world. So, Monika, thank you so much just for your brilliant input there of years of experience. And that model, I really think, you know, we all can look at. Especially from a government perspective as well. So thank you, Monika. And really, I would like to introduce Regina, who will be saying the final words now for this brilliant side event. And Regina is, and I will say it because I have it in front of me, Regina is the Secretary General of the World Federation Against Drugs. She also spearheads the Gender Working Group coordinator for WFAD. She's also the board member of the UN Women Sweden, chair of the Gothenburg unit of UN Women Sweden, and vice chair of the Gender and Development in Practice. Lastly, she has a seat in the Civil Society Forum on Drugs and an expert group to the European Commission and leads the WFAD team consisting of the Secretariat, a country office in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and a liaison office in Kenya. So without further ado, Regina, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chantel, and I apologize for all of you who thought that we were done. I will try to keep my remarks a bit shorter than what I had planned for since we are over time, but I'm glad to see so many of you who are still here. And first of all, thank you again, Chantel, and thank you to all the incredible speakers who have so brilliantly highlighted the strength-based approaches and challenging stigma around addiction and recovery, and for sharing your personal stories with us. It's just an incredible journey, this side event in itself, and to follow the journeys that you have all embarked on. I was asked to say a few last words on behalf of the Gender Working Group, and to mention what this is in 2020, WFAD set a 10-year plan to focus particularly on the rights and the needs of women and children within our field. This was an important step, as there are still today quite a few amount of organizations at the global level that specifically addresses the situation around women facing addiction and women in recovery. So the Gender Working Group serves a good function for this and includes strong experts from around the world who work together to highlight these issues. By addressing the intersecting vulnerabilities that women who use drugs and women in recovery face, including that of gender-based violence, access and availability of healthcare, childcare, and the correlation with illicit drug use and addiction to other vulnerable situations. And all the while highlighting the strength of women and advocating for the inclusion of women as champions of recovery. So as we heard from Monika in the beginning, over the past decade, we have seen the growth of recovery movement and an introduction of evidence and strength-based models for improving outcomes for people who seek to embark on their recovery journey. Unfortunately, one of the main barriers, as we've heard today, in accessing services and gaining social capital is stigma. People who use drugs and people in recovery in general, and women who use drugs and women in recovery in particular, are often faced with stigma, exclusion, and marginalization, three obstacles that pose substantial barriers. We had the opportunity to hear from the UNODC Executive Director Ghada Wali this morning, who highlighted the fact that stigma is a main barrier for women who use drugs. And although stigma differs in various regions, in various contexts, it's certainly something that is evident in all countries across the globe. And that's something we need to continuously address. And hopefully, with the words of Ghada Wali from this morning, we will have the UNODC's support in spearheading this moving forward. Women and girls as champions of recovery function as change makers for inclusion and development. Your participation and leadership are needed when ensuring equal access to evidence-based and trauma-informed services that recognize substance use as a healthcare issue. Advancing gender equality in the context of drug policy, ensuring equal access to services, reducing barriers in accessing these services, and reducing stigma against women who use drugs and women in recovery are essential to achieve an inclusive and sustainable development and ensure the needs of women all over the world are met. So to conclude, it is high time that society acknowledges the important role of supportive communities and recovery champions of all genders and the roles that they play in advocating for and providing recovery-oriented systems of care, which is why this remarkable event in particular is so important, so that we together can explore and see positive examples of evidence and personal stories whilst creating connections among one another. So to close, I will lend Tina's words: people can and do recover. Lived experiences and best practices are critical in the reintegration of people in recovery and in showcasing the fact that recovery is possible. So thank you very much to all of you for being here with us today. Thank you to our fantastic, incredible speakers and to the participants that stayed on for quite a few minutes onwards, but we hope that we can connect together again and continue this great work. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Amazing work.